you for coming to the webinar. Today we're going to talk about GPL-TOX, and specifically we're going to talk, first we'll talk about our new chemicals that we're going to be analyzing, then we'll talk about the chemicals that we've been analyzing for the past year, and I'll talk about some of the results we've had for detoxification of these chemicals. So why are we wanting to test for these chemicals? The answer is that the chemicals are on the increase. The production of them, the number of chemicals that people are exposed to every year has increased dramatically. So from like the 1940s, when we've really started forming these synthetic chemicals, to the present day, you see a geometric increase every year. So now we're producing almost 250 billion kilograms of synthetic organic chemicals every year. So what are these sources of toxic chemicals? So the sources are the air, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, the soil, and then the products that we put on ourselves, like your shampoo, your soap, things that you clean your house with. And all these like hit your different organs, your lungs, your liver, your heart, your brain. So we're going to talk about a lot of these different chemicals and where they're hitting, and where you're being exposed to them. And pretty much you're being exposed to all different places in your house. In your bedroom, in your kitchen, in your bathroom, in your garage, your lawn. All these are different places that you could be exposed to inside your own home. So what are some of the symptoms of toxicity? Well, some of these symptoms are loss of energy, memory loss, depression, anxiety, restlessness, nausea, allergies, frequent colds. So if you're sick a lot of times we've seen the people that have been sick a lot, we like find that they've been exposed to something later, like either heavy metals or a lot of these different organophosphates have been causing a lot of people to have chronic illnesses. So why test? Well, chemicals are everywhere. And how to test. So first you need to determine if your treatment is working. If you're going to do a detox, first you need to know what your starting point is. Then you get to have a goal of where you're trying to get to. Are you trying to, like when you first show up, you're in the 90th percentile of organophosphates, you want to get down to about the 40th percentile. So that gives you a goal. So that's what the testing can do. The most reliable testing is using an LCMS. That's liquid chromatography mass spec. It's a lot better than doing an immunoassay because immunoassays are not as sensitive. And then immunoassays, you can like develop an antibody in your body for one of these chemicals, but then you're not going to be able to determine if you got rid of it or not, because you'll always have those antibodies. So you're not going to be able to determine if the exposure is acute or chronic in these type of situations. So now I'm introducing our test GPL-TOX, which came out last year, but now we are revamping. We used to have 162 different chemicals that are now we are up to 172 different chemicals. So, what am I going to be talking about today? So first off, I'm going to talk about our new analytes. Then I'll rehash, in case some of you aren't familiar with, I'll talk about our current analytes that we've been testing for the last year. Then I'll talk about one of our add-on tests for the GPL-TOX, the glyphosate, which is also known as Roundup. Then I'll talk about some markers for mitochondrial damage. And then lastly in this talk, I'll be talking about some detoxification methods. How can you get rid of these different chemicals out of your body? So the first new analyte we have is diphenyl phosphate, which is pretty much a flame retardant. And you see it all over the place. You see it on children's clothes, you see it on products, you see it on our furniture and home insulation. Diphenyl phosphate is throughout your home. We're going to be looking at a metabolite of it called triphenyl phosphate, and this is also used as a flame retardant. So used in plastics, nail polish, electronics. It's been shown to be a carcinogen, so that means it can cause cancer. It's also an endocrine receptor, and it can lead to developmental problems. Our next compound that we're going to be measuring is acrylamide. So one of the biggest exposures that people have of acrylamide is actually from their food. So you have like potatoes or a lot of starches or coffee or wheat. At high temperatures, it can allow these chemicals to form acrylamide, which then you take it into your body, and then your body actually forms adducts inside your body after it gets activated inside your body. And then what kind of things can form adducts too? What forms adducts are two different things. It can form adducts of proteins, causing the proteins not be as functional, or it can cause adducts to DNA. And this is really bad because once it forms a product of DNA, then it can cause mutations in DNA. So this can lead to cancer. So your DNA won't be able to copy itself correctly, and then these false copies can lead to oncogenes being formed, which can lead to cancer. So acrylamide is considered to be a mutagen. There's a lot of papers that indicate this. It also can cause neurological damage. So the mutagen is when it forms the adducts with the DNA, and then the neurological damage can be formed when the acrylamide is forming adducts with proteins like in the nervous cells. So here's a paper right here. This is a recent paper showing acrylamide induces specific DNA adduct formations and gene mutations in the carcinic site. This particular study was done with mice. So there's a lot of studies showing that when you feed mice these acrylamides, you're seeing a lot of tumors being formed. Our next compound is perchlorate. It's also known as rocket fuel, but it's used for a lot of different, it has a lot of different uses in industry. It's a human toxicity is caused by perchlorate's ability to block iodine transport. So iodine is really important in your thyroid. So the iodine goes in and out through the thyroid, but perchlorate binds up these transporters, these sodium iodine transporters, so that the iodine can't go in. So iodine is actively transported into cells via the transmembrane protein known as a sodium iodine transporter, but perchlorate blocks this transporter, so the iodine is not able to be transported in. And perchlorate has been shown to be polluting lots of different areas of drinking water. There's almost 36 different states that have been shown by the EPA to have perchlorate contaminating their drinking water. So it's very prevalent. A lot of communities, especially in Southern California, have very high amounts of perchlorate, as you can see here. But pretty much the whole Midwest and the West and lots of the East have significant amounts of perchlorate in their drinking water. Our next compound that we're going to be looking at is 1,3-butadiene, which is a metabolite of tires. So where you're going to be exposed to. There's really the newest type of exposure is playgrounds, because a lot of the time they've been grinding up tires and you're putting them on the floor of the playground, or these playing fields, soccer fields, football fields, lacrosse fields. All these different types of fields they've been grinding up tires and placing them on the field. Well, it's been showing that a lot of these players that have been playing on these fields have been having increased rates of cancer. 1,3-butadiene has been shown to be linked with increased cancer. And not only are you being exposed to 1,3-butadiene on these fields, but there's a lot of other compounds that you could be tracking well with them. You get your arsenic, your benzene, your heavy metals, which includes lead, mercury, your PAHs, your polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons. A lot of these come with the 1,3-butadiene. So if you're tracking the 1,3-butadiene, you could also track a lot of these other compounds as well. Like if you're exposed to 1,3-butadiene, you're also probably being exposed to these other compounds. Our next compound is propylene oxide, which is used for production of plastics. It's used as a fumigant for foods, such as like nuts and almonds. It's also used as a herbicide and a microbicide. And it has been there's a lot of papers for it linking it to being a human carcinogen. So that's the reason why we decided to go ahead and start monitoring this compound as well. So next we have 1-bromopropane and ethylene oxide. For both of these compounds have been used in dry cleaning. They're also used for a lot of other industrial processes. They've been shown to be linked to decreased cognitive functions because they cause nervous system damage. So 1-bromopropane has been one of the its maximum estimated number of businesses using 1-bromopropane is about over 9,000, and possibly 69,000 estimated workers have been potentially exposed to 1-bromopropane at these businesses, according to EPA. So there's a lot of like people that are working in industry are being exposed to this. So industrial exposure is also a thing that we want to try to like help patients with our new GPL-TOX. Next we have acrylonitrile, which is used in production of acrylic fibers, resins, and rubber. Acrylonitrile exposure can lead to nerve damage. So there's a lot of different plastics are formed with acrylonitrile. So that's how you can be exposed to it. So these are our 8 new analytes that we're going to be looking at, and we're including them in with our GPL-TOX at no additional charge. So starting next week, if you run a GPL-TOX, you'll be getting these new analytes with our current old analytes that we were measuring before. And now I'm going to talk about some of our old analytes just for people that aren't familiar with analytes that we were measuring before. And our old analytes will look like our pesticides and herbicides, which include your organophosphates, pyrethrins, 2,4-D. Then I'll talk about the phthalates, which are kind of like your plastics. And I'll talk about some solvents that we're measuring, styrene, and then I'll talk about some fuel additives. So pesticides and herbicides have been increasing in number throughout since the 1960s. You had like 100 million pounds before. Now we're over almost 500 million pounds of different pesticides used in plants and U.S. agriculture. One of these main ones that are used are called organophosphates. And organophosphates are an ester of phosphoric acid. It's the basis of most insecticides, herbicides, and nerve agents. And the way that we track most of these organophosphates is its metabolism into DMP. So like one of the parents could be malathion, which malathion gets metabolized down to DMP. There's a lot of these organophosphates that are metabolized to DMP. There's at least 74 different organophosphates that once they enter the body, they get metabolized down to this DMP, this dimethyl phosphate. So by measuring DMP, we can measure a lot of different exposure to a lot of different organophosphates. And our second organophosphate that we wanted to look at was DEP. So DEP is diethyl phosphate. So you have like a parent here that gets metabolized by PON1 to DEP. So now we're measuring DEP after that. And there's at least 77 different organophosphates that we know of that get metabolized down to DMP. So if you're the test you're ordering, our GPL-TOX, is looking at DMP plus DEP, that alone is looking at 151 different organophosphates that you can be measuring against. Exposure organophosphates can cause chronic illness. And there's a lot of different papers that measure this. I mean, neuropsychiatric evaluation of patients that have been exposed to organophosphates. So here's a study here looking at children, and they were testing them, and they correlated how much pesticides they're exposed to their test scores. And the ones that have been exposed to the most amounts of organophosphates have far less physical endurance than the controls, and they had inferior eye-hand coordination. And one of the simplest tests they could do is to draw a stick figure. And the ones that have been exposed to the highest amount of organophosphates weren't able to really draw the stick figure nearly as well as the non-exposed children could do. The children exposed to a pesticide have more than twice the risk of developing pervasive developmental disorder, and children exposed to organophosphates have a 7-fold higher rate of autism. Pregnant mothers exposed were more likely to have shorter pregnancies, and the children that they gave birth to had a higher rate of impaired reflexes. Secondly, autistic children are more susceptible to organophosphates. So before when I was talking about the DEP, so DEP gets organophosphates gets metabolized by PON1 to form DEP. But the patients that have autism have a lot less PON1 than normal controls do. So here's your autistic group here is your control group. You see a decreased amount of PON1 activity in the autistic group. So this means that they're not able to break down organophosphates nearly as well as other neurotypical children. So our next group is pyrethrins, which is the common insecticides. So these pyrethrins were based upon chrysanthemums, but then they like change the chemical structure of them, so it's kind of based on there, but it's not really. It's a much more potent chemical now. So these toxins were derived from flowers, which were targeting the nervous system of insects. Well, it targets insect nervous systems. It also attacks human insect nervous systems. It is one of the most commonly used pesticides. These pyrethrins, as I said before, are crude extracts of the chrysanthemum flower, which is toxic to humans and animals. But they've done a synthetic insecticidal chemicals that have been based on this. And these are much more toxic than the original flower chemical. So the way that we measure these is we look at several of these different pyrethrins, and they get all metabolized down to a common chemical called 3-PBA, which is 3-phenobenzoic acid. So by measuring these 3-PBA, we can at least measure at least 3 different of these pyrethrins. These pyrethrins have a lot of toxicity. There's a paper recently that shows that exposure to it can lead to Parkinson's. It can alterate dopamine transporter function, and also leads to motor neuron disease. These pyrethrins have also been shown in another study that they took 8 to 15-year-old participants. They measured how much exposure they were having to these pyrethrins, or they measured the 3-PBA, the same chemical that we measure in our GPL-TOX. The children with the highest 3-PA above the limit of detection were twice as likely to have ADHD compared with those below the LOD, so the LOD is the limit of detection. Hyperactive impulsive symptoms increased by 50% for every 10-fold increase in 3-PBA. So let's say you have 1 parts per billion. Well, if you have 10 parts per billion, you have a 50% increased risk of having ADHD. Next chemical is 2,4-D. So 2,4-D was one of the main ingredients in the chemical used in the Vietnam War called Agent Orange. And it's a very potent chemical which kills a lot of broadleaf plants, but it's also very harmful to humans. And it's been tracked with a lot of different diseases like heart disease, hyperthyroidism, and cancer. And the next compound that we have is phthalates. So everybody knows about phthalates. Phthalates are parts of a lot of different plastics, and what makes plastics kind of bendable. And it's used as a plasticizer. Like I said, it makes it bendable. But it's also used in lubricants, gelling agents, paints, perfumes, and pesticides. And phthalates have a lot of different properties to them. They can cause abnormal sexual development in boys, cause premature puberty in girls, and elevates neurotoxic quinoic acid, reduction of sexual function in men, abnormal weight gain, autoimmunity, organ damage, and cancer are all linked to phthalates. Obesity, diabetes, and attention deficit disorder have also been linked to phthalates. So first I'm going to produce a case study. So this is the first of 4 case studies I'm going to be presenting in this talk. And this one was from a patient that came to our lab, a 77-year-old woman who was a painter with extreme fatigue. She also had autoimmune issues. So we measured several of her different, we did the organo GPL-TOX on her, and her phthalates were one of the highest ones I've ever seen. She had a 19,000 on the MEP. So what we did with her is we changed her paints. She went through a detox program, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And 6 months later, she had improved energy and her arthritis had improved. So showing that we had a beginning point here for her, we had an end point here. So after being able to go through the 6 months, we were able to decrease the amount of phthalates that she is having in her body. Our next compound is solvents. So our solvents are in gasoline oil, tobacco smoke, industrial emissions, glues, paints, furniture wax, detergents, rubber products. So what are some of these solvents? So the first one is xylene. It's also known as dimethylbenzenes. These are found in your paints, your pesticides, your cleaning fluids, cigarette smoke. And the way that we measure it is that xylenes are metabolized by the liver to methylpuric acid. So we're measuring a methylpuric acid in the urine. Our second solvent is benzene, and benzene toxicity is very important because it can cause drowsiness, rapid heart rate, tremors, confusion, vomiting, sleepiness, coma, and even death. The way that we're measuring benzene is benzene gets metabolized down to N-acetylphenylcysteine. Our next compound is styrene. Styrene is a component in a lot of green technology. It's also in carpeting, electronics, fresh food packaging, toys. I mean, any type of styrofoam has styrene in it. One of the biggest thing that causes people to get styrene is styrofoam cups. One study that we've done is that you can have some free styrene is in all styrofoam cups. And it's dissolved by heat. So what you can do is you can pour coffee into you can weigh a styrofoam cup, pour coffee into it, wait about half an hour, pour the coffee out, weigh the cup again. The cup is going to weigh less than it did to begin because you're going to have these styrenes that are going to be dissolved by the coffee and then go into the coffee, and then when you ingest the coffee, you're ingesting the styrenes. So what we recommend is use containers that don't contain any styrofoam, especially when you're using hot liquids. So how do we measure styrene in human urine? So styrene is metabolized by the P450s to styrene oxide, and then it's metabolized down by ADLHD to mandelic acid. And then we take the mandelic acid goes to PGA. So we are measuring PGA in our GPL-TOX. Toxicity can cause nausea, CNS, so your central nervous system depression. It also can cause damages in the lungs. And what you can see here is either two different mouse studies. There's one mouse study either with no styrene added or having styrene 400 milligrams added in. You can see a lot of tumors being formed in the lungs to the mouse that is being fed the styrene. So styrene has been shown to be very carcinogenic. Also causes necrosis, which is like cell death, and it can cause respiratory paralysis. Our next compound that we're going to be looking at is fuel additives, and there's two different ones that we're looking at. You have your methyl tert-butyl and your ethyl and methyl tert-butyl. And these are common additives added to gasoline. The purpose of these is to cause gasoline to not, when it gets burned, to not form carbon monoxide, but to form a greater portion of it to form carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, these MTBEs and ETBEs have been getting into the water supply. And the way to do this is a lot of these tanks that they store gasoline in leak, and these leaky gasoline tanks seep into the water supply, causing mass contamination. The way that we measure these at is we're measuring it into the 2-hydroxyisobutyrate. So those are all of our GPL-TOX compounds. So now I'm going to talk about a little bit about one of our add-on tests, which is glyphosate. So glyphosate is the main ingredient in Roundup, and you can track with a lot of other chemicals that are in Roundup. So if you're not just exposed to being glyphosate, you're exposed to a lot of other chemicals that are in Roundup as well. And the glyphosate by itself has been, the World Health Organization has said, a probable carcinogen. Glyphosate usage has also been on the rise since 1990. So now it's almost 400,000 children with autism, and it's being the amount of glyphosate added is 80,000 tons are added every year. So what's glyphosate really causing? So the biggest problem with it is it's very damaging to your good bacteria in your gut. So you have your good bacteria, which is your lactobacillus, then you have your bad bacteria, which is like your C. difficile. The effects of Roundup, the paper from 3 years ago, shows that glyphosate causes decreased amounts of lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is one of your main beneficiary bacteria. There's another paper showing that it causes more gluten intolerance. And as I did before, the main thing about glyphosate is that it's causing C. diff right here, C. diff overgrowth. But C. diff overgrowth causes more 4-cresol to be in the body. So this leads to our second case study, which is glyphosate. So we're looking here as a 79-year-old woman who has depression. And we measured her glyphosate, and she was over the 95th percentile here. So the way that we're measuring this is that our measures is micrograms of glyphosate over grams of creatinine. Our LOQ for our test is 0.38. Our 75th percentile is 1.8. And what this 75th percentile means is that if we measure 100 people, if you're in the 75th percentile, that means that only 25 of those 100 will have a higher value than you do. 75 of them will have a lower value. If you're above the 95th percentile, that means only 5 people will have a higher value of 100 than you would. So, as I mentioned before, if you have exposure to glyphosate, you have a chance of having more C. difficile growing in your intestines. And for this patient here, you can see here, C. difficile leads to 4-cresol. This 79-year-old woman here had very high 4-cresol in her organic acid test. This is the organic acid test results right here on the bottom. So here's our organic acid test for looking at C. diff. So C. diff causes 4-cresol. The problem with 4-cresol is it inhibits dopamine beta hydroxylase. So this inhibits dopamine to get hydroxylized to norepinephrine. So for the same patient here, what we saw here is that she's had a lot of dopamine in her system with a lot of HVA, but her MVA or VMA was decreased. So you have to look at this HVA-VMA ratio here. She had a lot of HVA compared to VMA, so this can cause depression or anxiety. So here's the other part of our GPL-TOX. So for a lot of these other chemicals, when you're being exposed to, there's 2 different things that we've noticed. We've noticed a lot of mitochondrial stress. And how do you measure mitochondrial stress? Well, there's 2 ways that we've been able to track with high mitochondrial stress. The first of these is Ti-glykoglycine. So on our GPL-TOX, we are measuring Ti-glykoglycine as a specific marker for mitochondrial damage. Your other marker that you can look at is on the OAT. We've also been able to track that people that have high values on a lot of different compounds for their GPL-TOX have a high succinic acid as well. So if you have a high succinic acid on the OAT, that also could lead to being that you have either high organophosphates, high xylene, high heavy metals. So a lot of those compounds seem to cause your succinic acid marker to go up. So Ti-glykoglycine. What we're measuring here is Ti-glykoglycine is an offshoot of your respiratory chain in the mitochondria. So really you want to be going from your isoleucine branched chain amino acids down to your acetyl-CoA. But if there's mitochondrial stress, you get a buildup here of your Ti-glykoglycine, which can get measured in our GPL-TOX, showing that you are having mitochondrial stress. So here's our case study 3, or what I call don't live near a fracking plant. So this is a 5-year-old boy who's severely autistic. He was diagnosed with pandas. He lived on a farm which was taking the main source of water was well water. And this was this farm that they had was several miles from a fracking field. And we looked at it as 2 HbA, or 2 HIB, which is the measuring marker for 2 MTBE. And his markers was one of the highest ones I've seen, over 19,000. But that wasn't just it. His styrene marker was over almost 700, which was over the 95th percentile. His vinyl chloride marker, the TDG, was over the 95th percentile as well. And then his oxalates were extremely high. And why would his oxalates be high? Well, the reason why is when you get exposed to a lot of these different compounds, your immune system gets deactivated or gets repressed. So this allows a lot of yeast or bacteria to form, and these yeast can cause you to form a lot of oxalates. Or you're also seeing a lot of stress in the mitochondria. And as I said before, succinic acid is elevated in a lot of these patients that are exposed to a lot of different chemicals. So this patient right here, he had a value of 265, which the high range is 23. So we had a tenfold increase in succinic acid for this particular patient. So he was doing a lot of mitochondrial stress caused by his exposure to all these different chemicals. His diet-glycoglycine was also very high. It was a 28, and our 95th percentile is an 8. So we had a threefold increase from our 95th percentile for this one patient. So this was a very sick patient, and one of the main reasons why he was so sick was because he was exposed to all these different chemicals. So you're exposed to all these different chemicals. What can you do? Well, what I tell a lot of my patients that I talk to and the doctors are, we change their diet to non-GMO organic foods. And then we have to try to get these chemicals out. So what can you do? Well, a lot of studies have shown that a lot of these chemicals come out through sweat. So you have to exercise to develop sweat. And these chemicals are released then. But then you have to use a towel to remove the sweat so the chemicals aren't reabsorbed back into the body. We also recommend using infrared saunas. So these infrared saunas, the energy goes really deep into the fat, breaking down the fat, releasing some of these chemicals. So for the first several weeks after you start doing these processes, your amount of chemicals that you see in your urine might actually go up. But then over a period of time, let's say 3 or 4 months, your values will start decreasing again. And after 6 months, you should hopefully be at a much safer, healthier status. What else can you do? Well, your folate, you need to increase your folate, your B6, B12, your TMG, which all help PON1 eliminate toxic homocysteine and break down these organophosphates. Use oral intravenous glutathione. So glutathione binds a lot of these different chemicals and then allows them to become more polar, which then allows the kidney to excrete them. What we recommend is about 500 milligrams per day oral dose for the glutathione. And then a lot of these different waters, a lot of these chemicals are in our drinking water, unfortunately. So I recommend using distilled reverse osmosis water in your house. Install some type of filtering system into your house. And don't use these pitchers, because a lot of these pitchers they're like plastic pitchers, and they don't really filter out a lot of these different chemicals out. They filter out calcium, and they filter out small amounts of lead, but not a lot of these organophosphates or xylene or MTBE or ETBE. So our next one is my next case study is talking about detoxification. So what we have here is a 55-year-old woman who had sudden rheumatoid arthritis, and she had increased food sensitivity. So what she had glyphosate, and it was very high. She had 1.94. Her vinyl chlorides were very high, and her NAP was very high. So we installed a reverse osmosis filter in her house. She started doing infrared sauna twice a week for 3 weeks. And actually, even in this short period of time, she had really great turnaround. We saw here as her glyphosate was 1.94. Well, after only about a month, we were able to get it down to 1.02. And then we were able to get the TDG down. So we had vinyl chloride was down to non-detect, as well as the NAP, which is our benzene marker, also got down to below the lower limit of quantification. So it's pretty much a 0. So sauna, reverse osmosis filters, these things seem to work. So she actually, this is 2 months of treatment, had a lot more energy. And she actually had improved movement in her joints already. So it seemed like over a short period of time, she's already having a lot less mitochondrial stress and inflammation in her body. So how do you what's the best way of doing this test? So the best way of doing it is through our EnviroTOX panel. So this will give you your organic acid test, your GPL-TOX, your glyphosate, all in one sample, just one urine sample, one morning urine. All we need is 10 mils of urine, and it's all for one discounted price. So thank you very much for all you listening. I'll be taking some questions now.